It's not often I get to speak in a setting like this. My mother-in-law could see me now. It's great to be in this beautiful space, in part because I was here in the very early days of the project, when they were still figuring out what it would take to bring this magnificent building back to its late 19th century glory, and to see that completed in this magnificent way is just a great treat. This place could have easily ended up a pile of stone and dust and broken glass. We are, after all, literally just yards from where the massive Lower Manhattan Expressway would have connected with the Manhattan Bridge after bulldozing its way across downtown from the Holland Tunnel. I first read Jane Jacobs when I was living not too far from here on East 10th Street near the corner of Avenue A, just down the block from the Russian Baths, a stone's throw from Tompkins Square Park, which was not the idyllic place that it is. In an East Village that wasn't even regarded as valuable enough to start tearing down. The system was not only carrying millions of strap hangers a day, but at that time also qualified as the world's largest open-air urinal, an enormous moving canvas for artists and vandals, a city beneath the city that distilled all the menace, the dysfunction, and threat of a place that felt by the late 70s and early 80s to be just over. I know a lot of you remember what New York was like in those latter years of Abe Beame, in the months after Ford to City dropped dead. When somewhere around DeKalb Avenue, the B train would grind to a halt on a steaming summer evening and the lights would go out, the fans would shut off, a garbled and unintelligible message would squawk through the speakers, and hundreds of people would be unusually quiet. It was at once a very intimate and very isolating experience to be cooped up on, let's say, a July night in the dark with a couple of thousand people you've never laid eyes on before. It was a place without much reason to hope. New York seemed to be a place where recovery seemed like a long shot. And the significance of this decline in the political debates of the late 20th century is really hard to overstate. New York's failures were pounced on with glee by every writer, elected official, every public intellectual who needed proof in the late century scrum that the New Deal was a failure, that the Great Society was a failure, that multiculturalism was a failure, that the post-war urban liberal consensus was a failure. This was their standing proof, their evidence. Just look at New York. This was their proof that places like New York belonged to a past filled with romantic ideas about the city. A past of WPA murals, misplaced optimism in early public housing, the disdain for the organic or disorderliness of the pre-automobile city. What the urbanists of the late 19th and early 20th century really wanted was to uncity the city. De-densify, decentralize, de-randomize, a place that worked. A place that created 1 + 1 = 3 magic because of its concentrated energy and its willingness to make room for the passing run of humanity. The Ebenezer Howards, the Louis Mumfords, the Frank Lloyd Wrights, the Corbusiers wanted to tame the energy of the urban environment and place the human beings who created the hugger-mugger of the unplanned into a pristine, orderly dreamscape. Look at Corbusier's drawings of La Ville Radieuse, Radiant City. There are no people in the pictures, just shining buildings and empty parks. That was their dream. And while Jane Jacobs turned her back on the 20th century utopians, who sought to tidy up human nature. She was not a sentimentalist, and that accusation has been leveled at her many times. She was not a starry-eyed idealist, not someone who wished that people were different from who they really were. She based her ideas in lived experience, an observation of human and economic systems, and rooting both economics and human society firmly in nature. Look not only to her celebrated Death and Life of Great American Cities, but to her perhaps less read but still no less important Cities and the Wealth of Nations, or The Nature of Economies, to see a hard-headed, clear-eyed view of the economic life of cities. These places only work if they're not only social spaces, but economic places as well. The age of suburbia sought to a degree that we're fully appreciating only now to completely remove these realms from one another, to put all the commercial life of a community in one place and all the domestic life of the community in another place. And we're now reckoning with the damage that was wrought, pouring money into that dream. Jane Jacobs was not the dreamer. Ebenezer Howard was the dreamer. Frank Lloyd Wright was the dreamer. The suburban dreams that moved all the separate functions of life far from each other to be stitched together by the individual citizen using a handy 3,000-pound tool, the personal automobile. That leaves the person who can't drive, or God forbid, just doesn't want to drive, eternally dependent on others to do even the most basic tasks of daily life, or waiting in vain until suburban jurisdictions finally see the value in providing and subsidizing transit. While heaping contempt on public transportation's needs for subsidy, the automobile's apologists saw no irony at all in their never-ending demand for subsidized highways, the demand for tax abatements from private industry to induce investments that companies were going to make anyway. The blazing, all too obvious contradictions seemed not to register, as if by just brazening it out, politicians from suburban America could endlessly heap scorn on various kinds of subsidy for urban America while sliding all the chips to their side of the table. For 40 years, the suburb won every argument and created for us a built environment that will be a drag on development, an environmental nightmare, and no place to grow old for millions of people. We're at the front end of a demographic tidal wave. And if you think about some of the places you've visited, or maybe even lived, think about trying to be 75 in those places. Think about trying to be 85 in those places, as millions more people will be in the coming years. It doesn't seem like a very nice place to be either old or young. But when you're in a place like this, not just this building, but the neighborhood that surrounds it, that fight, that argument, seems very much a relic of the last century. But a new set of worries has arisen to take the place of the "is the city dead" worry. Even as New York returns to its post-war heights in population and begins a new era as the ingatherer of nations, a place that becomes the Plymouth Rock, the gateway, the place that begins millions of American journeys. A dozen or so years ago, I spoke to the annual meeting of the National Association of Realtors. And I told the very satisfied and happy assemblage of men and women, riding a wave of new construction, unprecedented sales volume, and new highs in the rate of home ownership, that their business was overseeing the construction of new housing units faster than the population was growing, that their business was helping to facilitate year after year of home prices rising faster than the American family's income, that new units were even rising in places like metropolitan Cleveland and metropolitan St. Louis, places increasing the amount of inhabitable space as the overall population of the metropolitan area was shrinking. That's not capitalism, that's cannibalism. That's making every existing inhabitable unit worth less money on the market by building more housing than is needed by the people who need to be housed. I told the National Association of Realtors that there was simply no way for all these things to continue. It won't surprise you to hear my address was met with a mixture of silence and barely polite applause. In other words, I know how Larry Wilmore felt the other night at the correspondence. And I made it back to my table, and one of my luncheon hosts leaned across the table and said, "You don't understand. It's different this time." No, it wasn't. It wasn't different, but persistent demand has continued to exert pressure here and in specific American markets across the country. The Bay Area, San Jose, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Boston, have all managed to leverage scarcity into endless profit. San Francisco is a peninsula. They aren't making any more of it, and it's hemmed in by neighboring jurisdictions. Boston is a bunch of outcroppings into a bay. They aren't making any more Boston, and it's hemmed in by its neighboring jurisdictions. New York is clustered around a set of islands, and while we've made a little bit more of it, Manhattan's bigger today than it was when Peter Stuyvesant was governor, they aren't making much more. The eye-watering prices for the junkiest living space, the eternal seller's market, fills the pages of newspapers with gee whiz copy in the real estate sections and versions of "can you believe this" stories as places that look about the size of a cell on Rikers Island, you find out is now renting for $4,000 a month, but utilities are included. But there's less coverage of the violence that this does to cities as a social system. Dense urban areas have concentrated, intensified the trends that are already underway in the wider society. And as we wring our hands about what to do with a system that quickly and efficiently moves $1 of new earning or $1 of new profit up the ladder to be captured by the people already doing best in the society, as the middle rungs of the ladder are kicked out and a longitudinal, steady middle-class life becomes difficult to attain from the bottom earning quintiles. New York and its peer metros are still engaged in a generations-long argument about the right role of government in a marketplace, the just level of participation in the public sector when it comes to what is, after all, mostly privately traded goods, a place to live. For years, economists, developers, free market theorists have talked long and argued hard that the ideal level of market intervention, even in a place like New York, is none. None at all. That the marketplace would operate better if there was not all these various kinds of regulation, subsidized housing, rent control, rent stabilization, public housing, the things that grew up in the mid-20th century to try to keep cities like New York a place where not only the wealthy lived. That the operation of the market, seeking profit, seeking customers, seeking advantage, would provide housing for New Yorkers at every level of income if the government just got out of the way. Do any of you believe that if the government just got out of the way, there would be housing in New York City for people of all walks of life and at every level of income? I don't know what you think. I don't. The free market does not provide that housing. There's money to be made in rental housing for middle-class people. The marketplace does not build it. Ask yourself, absent public housing, absent the hundreds of tower blocks containing thousands of units that run like a ribbon along the East River, starting really just steps from the front door of the shul and run up all the way up the drive toward the top of Manhattan Island. Would private developers build, would landlords maintain affordable units of any kind on Manhattan Island, or in much of Brooklyn and Queens now? For years, the owners of multiple dwellings have been an extractive class, able to command profit without investment, able to raise rents and sales prices, often with no commensurate investment in the intrinsic value of their properties. While at the same time, many of these people head into the debate trumpeting their status as risk-takers, investors, adventurers who deserve a healthy return on their investment. Deserving is a kind of funny word. We're very careful about when we use it. When we use it about ourselves, when we use it about others. It's like one of those chemicals with tremendous explosive power, so often found in science fiction movies, that ends in a scene with a guy in a white coat with a tiny vial between his fingers, warning that he's going to blow us all to kingdom come. Deserving. Who deserves what? And for what? And when do they deserve it? This city is an economic system. It's why the place exists at all. But it's also a social system, and the two inevitably address each other. The median household income in the United States is $52,000 a year, roughly. The median household income in New York, with its higher cost of living, is roughly $51,000. So back to that explosive word, deserve. What do the half of all New Yorkers living in households that make less than $1,000 a week deserve? And the hundreds of thousands of families clustered just above that, what do they deserve? They do the work that makes this place run. Walk out these front doors on a weekday, head down the block, jump onto the subway and head to the Notions District, storefront after storefront selling buttons, snaps, and zippers. Head to the plant district and watch acres of green moving up and down ramps, onto sidewalks and into trucks. Walk past the sidewalks that as spring finally gets here. I mean, is it really May 4th? 50-something degrees? As spring eventually gets here. And the sidewalks will be full of diners whose dirty plates will quietly and efficiently be taken away and cleaned for the next set of customers by people who live, well, who knows where they live. Go to Coney Island Avenue muffler shops. Find a passenger side door for a 2005 Jetta in the Bronx. This amazing, teeming, hustling, growing place can't be a place where just rich people live. Can't become a place where the worst kind of extractive, rent-seeking behavior is not only tolerated, but celebrated. Can't become a place where families trying to marshal social capital in a way that allows them to climb the ladder toward more security, a little more prosperity, without having to spend 50, 60% of their monthly income to have a roof over their heads. Most of your parents didn't spend 60, 70% of their monthly income for a place to live. Mine didn't when I was growing up here. The tolerable burden of having a place to live made other things possible in the life of my family. And the arguments from tough-love capitalists who airily imagine working-class New Yorkers traveling 2 and 3 hours each way from, I don't know where, southern New Jersey or eastern Pennsylvania, so they could travel in to take care of their needs, while they themselves grab up all the subsidies they can, well, they just make me shake my head. There are aspects of that already happening. Go to Allentown, Pennsylvania at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you'll see sleepy former New Yorkers standing on line waiting to board buses to service jobs in Manhattan, Allentown, Pennsylvania. Do you know how far away that is? And yes, there are people who have gamed the rent control laws and are living large on a form of subsidy. Upper middle class people who could buy season tickets to the opera and take swell vacations because their landlord is forced to collect uneconomic rent from them. You see a story about them every now and then in the metro section. But they are anomalies. They are not the rule in New York in 2016. There are more than 3.4 million housing units in New York City and 27,000 rent-controlled apartments. So anytime somebody tells you, hey, it's rent control that's forcing this scarcity and making me charge a fortune for this crap apartment, you could tell them, no, sorry. I heard from this guy at Temple that there are only 27,000 rent-controlled apartments. Rent stabilization, admittedly, is a different beast altogether. There are about 1 million stabilized units, but the rent goes up and goes up steadily in a stabilized unit. In places where land prices and taxes are lower, are builders lining up to build multiple dwellings for which a healthy, steady rent can be collected? I mean, as a thought experiment, if you said, all right, fine, it's New York's terrible web of laws and subsidies and regulations that's creating artificial scarcity. So let's go to Kansas City. Let's go to Phoenix. Let's go to Las Vegas. Are there developers lining up to build apartment buildings for the thousands of service workers who would pay a steady rent, from whom you could make a nice living? No. No. We have a dysfunctional rental market, not only in this city, but in this country, forcing people who don't even want to buy a house to buy one because it's the only rational choice they can make in order to live somewhere reasonably close to where they work and keep their job. Developers, in the meanwhile, don't want to build housing for a ready market that's ready to pay. Just the other day, the Times featured a piece by the terrific Thomas Edsall called, "Where Should a Poor Family Live?" In it, Edsall gives the reader a fairly comprehensive view of the current state of play. Basically, America has a suggestion for where the country's struggling families should live, could live. Not here. For almost a century, cities like New York have created a legal and physical architecture, maintaining a place for lower-income families, while the surrounding jurisdictions were able to rig the game through various kinds of exclusionary zoning and access to transportation to make their communities at least hostile, at most impenetrable for lower-income families. The theorists say, oh, break up those urban concentrations of poverty, empty out public housing. So we hand people vouchers to head out to new places where the landlords won't accept the vouchers, where the county councils won't allow permits for multiple dwellings, where even the smallest influx of lower-income families sets off alarm bells about school quality, about crime, about real estate values. The answer I've gotten over the years might as well be, well, that's all well and good in practice, but let's talk about how it works in theory. Because that's what they want to do. They want to work on an imaginary model of a society where people clutching Section 8 vouchers find that they're welcomed in all the places they go in order to break up those high concentrations of poverty. If dollar signs are dancing in builders' heads as another public housing block falls to the wrecker's ball, those same interests seem to lose focus, get very fuzzy when it comes to answering the accompanying question, but where will they go? The answer appears to be they go to communities where people are as poor as they were in the places they left. But as demand for center city living space intensifies, these discrete pieces of economic pressure are feeding into the steady suburbanization of poverty. It's not new, but I think it hasn't yet penetrated a lot of people's consciousness, that the fast-growing spots, high concentration poverty spots in the country are now just outside the urban core. This time, the resegregation of living space is as much driven by income as skin color and ethnicity, but the two attributes still operate in a rough way as reliable proxies for each other. What's missing from the never-ending debates is a willingness to play any one piece of social policy forward into the out years, into the next 2 or 3 steps. Okay, we do this thing. What happens next? And what happens after that? What's missing is the willingness to ask ourselves hard questions about current day policies and what they eventually yield in results. We keep our eyes fixed on comforting narratives and seem incapable of doing anything really hard. Now, I somehow, and I'm not being disingenuous because it's the last thing I ever imagined, I somehow ended up living in $1 million house. Believe me, it's not the image that pops into your head when somebody says $1 million house. It wasn't anything like that when I bought it. And I'm shocked that it is one, but it is. Yet I drive on streets that resemble paths for medieval ox carts. My local underground rapid transit system in Washington is falling to pieces, with smoke-filled tunnels, head-on crashes, frantic evacuations, and a few weeks ago, a 29-hour shutdown of the entire system announced with 1 day's notice. It took federal lawsuits to rebuild public schools in Washington, D.C. My son's math class was stunned when a 40-pound piece of the ceiling landed with a thunderous boom on a, thank God, unoccupied desk. I got here this lunchtime on the country's most advanced train. Let me say that again. The country's most advanced train, connecting the nation's capital to its commercial and communications capital by ancient freight lines, lurching and bouncing for 225 miles, unable through much of the trip to bring a drink to my lips, and slowing to a crawl between Philadelphia and Trenton. Yes, Trenton makes and the world takes. I get to see that neon sign. Why? Because we're going 5 miles an hour. On the $200+ round trip Acela, the finest passenger train in the United States. I used to refer to it when I would tell my family I'm heading down to Union Station to get to the train as Bulgarian State Railway, but I'm willing to bet that the Bulgarians would be insulted if they took Acela and heard that I was calling it Bulgarian State Railway. We have moved in a century from being a can-do people to being a can't-do people, unable to muster enough common wisdom, common cause, or common will to build the things that need building, fix the things that need fixing, and create the conditions for the efficiency, workability, and progress that we always extol. We always talk about those things as being an outgrowth of capitalism and democracy. But in China, you can drink on the train. And you can actually reach your mouth with the bottle. You can get up and walk to a bathroom on a high-speed train and not have to do it with your hands up in the air to keep yourself from being thrown into somebody's lap as you head to the end of the car. Thank God there's plenty of time to put in requirements for poor people to pee in a cup in order to get their social benefits, to whine about the nanny state one day and then look over the shoulders of SNAP recipients to see what cuts of meat they're buying. There's time, plenty of time for that. While we're creating new models for urban education that help speed the movement of public dollars into private coffers, Look, people want what they want. Of course investors want subsidies. If subsidies were on the menu and I was an investor, I'd want a subsidy too. But we seem to have an allergy to calling it, as we do with contempt in other sectors and in other contexts, free stuff. I hear a lot about free stuff, but not free stuff when rich people want free stuff. Of course private entities look at the public money gushing through urban school systems and want a piece of the action. Of course developers want to get their hands on land previously developed for a public purpose and think of the fabulous buildings they could build. Where this stuff gets worked out is in politics. It becomes the ring where the wrestling matches between interests get decided. Jane Jacobs, always a sharp observer of interests and the way they exert power on process. She would ask, who wants what out of this and who would benefit? It makes these big fights a lot easier to follow. As a chronicler of the urban experience, she was peerless. And as an activist, she reminded a city so beaten down that it felt that it had to take anything, that regular people did have power. That's why there's no Lower Manhattan Expressway thundering by a few blocks away from me. That people could say no. That the demand to look past current inconvenience and unhappiness of today to the benefits of a shiny tomorrow is not always a deal that you are forced to accept. And, hey, wait a minute. Benefits and conveniences for who exactly? When new infrastructure is built to move people through places rather than to them. The lazy assumptions of the second half of the last century, that new was always better than old, that money plowed into suburbs was investment, but money plowed into cities was subsidy. They were wrong more often than they were right. And Jane Jacobs' observations were absolutely essential in providing an answer, a pushback to the tremendous motive power. Remember how the cities were emptying out in the 1960s. She was a champion. So a new generation of Janeites, I think we have to call them Janeites because Jacobites means something else, has a new generation of puzzles to solve. The very old, the very deep suspicion of the American city carries on even in the midst of the rebuilding and polishing and revival of all these wonderful places to be. The Jane Jacobs vision of what a living, organic city could be like is coming to fruition in a lot of places. But what's happening? Those places are becoming wider and richer all the time and becoming exclusive. Places where the common run of humanity will not be seen because the common run of humanity cannot live on Hudson Street any longer. The cities are essential. They're engines of culture, of commerce. They excite and delight. And yeah, they ask for a lot, but they give a lot in return. It wasn't all that long ago they were simply being counted out. Time to dust off that old copy of The Death and Life of Great American Cities and wonder at its prescience. You will see hints, foretellings of 21st century New York in that book. And it's a good way to mark the centennial of an important and essential New York. So, happy birthday, Jane, and thank you very much for having me.
Some questions from all of you, but he said something at the end that I think is worth pursuing because you did describe both New York and other cities as becoming more expensive, wider, harder for people to stay or live in at a reasonable price. And there are a lot of people out there who blame this on Jane, especially Greenwich Village. Well, look at Greenwich Village, they say. Jane Jacobs said nobody can afford to live there. Of course, that it's 50 years and that she didn't expect things not to change, and yes, there are no dock workers living there. But it's a metaphor for a very troubling challenge that everybody knows about, that the cities that we face everywhere. The gentrification issue is a clear one.
I think it's amazing that you would blame somebody who said, tear this down at your peril, that once it didn't get torn down, it became a more expensive place to live. So let's say we did tear down the West Village and filled it all with Corbusian towers. Would that have been an antidote to the West Village being a very expensive place to live today? Yes, these places were always delightful places to be. When you visit Boston, you don't go to Billerica and drive around suburban cul-de-sacs and subdivisions and look out your windshield. You go to Faneuil Hall, you go to the Back Bay, you go to Newbury Street, you go to Commonwealth Avenue. Well, and the North End. And if you go to San Francisco, I mean, you may get over the mountain pass to Stockton, or you may drive through San Rafael, or places further down Peninsula, but that's not where people want to be. That's not where they cool up. That's not where they come to see each other and just be in a gorgeous place that they can look at and look at each other and have a nice meal. That we listened, in many cases, to what Jane Jacobs had to say about what was worth saving and what was valuable about urban life. And then other economic forces took over in a way that made those places unattainable. It's not her fault. In a way, it's a confirmation of what she said, that these places were valuable and needed to be saved, because they are so desirable now that people bid up the cost of them beyond all imagining. Pete Hamill grew up on 7th Avenue, Brooklyn, around First President Street, around there. His father was a longshoreman. Believe me, if there are any longshoremen living in Park Slope today, they aren't living in the center of the slope on 7th Avenue. It's not a single effect set of operations, gentrification. Believe me, I know all the bad undertow that goes with it. But I lived in a gentrifying neighborhood in Chicago, and my neighbors were delighted. It's a funny thing, it was a gentrifying Puerto Rican neighborhood. And I moved in, and they were happy that a Puerto Rican yuppie existed who would buy the house. So they saw me as the sign of good things to come in a bizarre kind of way, and yet at the same time saw it as a very continuity-filled kind of thing. They used to be very excited that they saw me on TV because they assumed that the police would come if I called them. They were right. And they also were very pleased that our garbage was getting picked up, which starts to happen in gentrifying neighborhoods. So it's more complicated than just one thing. And to blame Jane Jacobs for that, I think is a little crazy.
Needless to say, I totally agree. I also like to point out that something that is not often talked about, there are solutions to the gentrification issue. There are ways to equal the playing field for property owners to stay, not just developers to come. But we don't level the playing field anymore, and that's part of the issue. Before I ask any more questions, let me open to the audience. And who has a question to pose to me?
In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was commitment to building affordable housing. There was Mitchell Lama, there was Questionably, public housing never replaced as many units as it demolished. At least there was an illusion of a commitment to building affordable housing. Why did it exist then?
If you didn't hear the question pointed out that during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was a commitment to building affordable housing in New York through various kinds of devices. He named Mitchell-Lama housing, but certainly if you look at Co-op City, if you look at the developments just north of 14th Street on the river, Peter Cooper Village and Stuyvesant Town, they used various kinds of legal devices and various kinds of shifting subsidies and tax policy to create an incentive for building affordable housing. Well, my first answer, why then and not now, was the summation of the question. My first answer would be to point out that I think the political temperature of the society is just extremely different now. That the impetus that led to the Great Society in the mid-1960s would be very hard. It would be very hard to marshal the political will to do the kinds of things that we seemed ready as a society to do then. New York was still, at that point, a largely working class city with a lot of people moving in fairly short order into the middle class, and many of those people not necessarily wanting to leave the city, which was something that you didn't have in a lot of other places where returning GIs and rising expectations and tight housing markets and racial animus created this terrible stew of social factors that people couldn't load up the moving vans fast enough in places like the southeast and southwest side of Chicago and head into brand new white flight suburbs just over the corporate boundaries. Because of scale, though certain things were possible in New York that simply weren't possible in other places. But I think that also the sort of winner-take-all temperature of these times, the idea that of that volatile word deserving, and all the hostility toward various kinds of subsidy and aid, the willingness to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some cases in state aid programs, $1 million to catch literally a handful of people who are on various forms of support with drugs in their system. The willingness to debate in the state legislature, keeping people from buying shellfish with their food stamps. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. The social realities and the political realities that allowed the creation of affordable housing in the 40s and 50s, I don't think they exist today. Where, if you think about it, what a house is for has changed during those 60 years. Your parents didn't expect to get rich selling their house. Am I mostly right as I look around the room here? I mean, your parents bought the house as a place to live. You got a little give on your tax return, you got a little help here and there, but basically the place you were buying it to live in. And it wasn't expected to be, at a time when a much larger percentage of workers had a defined benefit pension anyway, the thing that was going to be your nest egg. And now, increasingly, people are, look at there's a whole channel on television of people flipping houses. It's a house flipping channel, HGTV, where it exists because of this new idea about the house that you're constantly just buying them and selling them and fixing them and buying them and selling them as some sort of dreamscape rather than as, it's the one time I'll quote Le Corbusier approvingly. He called it a machine for living, and really, what is your house more than that? It is a machine for living. But now, curb appeal is more important, and resale value, and granite countertops, and all of that stuff. I mean, I'm going to guess that your father would have just looked at you quizzically if you had suggested that he get granite countertops. So what we think of housing as being for and the part it plays in our lives has changed a great deal as a speculative society has come in the late part of the last century.
It's all about private investment with public dollars, private development with public dollars, whether it's in our rebuilding of public housing, which we're densifying, turning over to private developers, our charter schools, our hospitals, our transportation, everywhere. It's about even the parks. You all know the parks in Brooklyn waterfront. They're all being, paid for with the dollars that are coming from the developers. The idea of public investment in public things seems to have gone out with high-button shoes. Hopefully someday that will come back, but for now it's...
I don't understand why a program wasn't initiated to keep the great swaths of Mitchell-Lama housing and New York State redevelopment, New York City Redevelopment Corporation housing subsidized, so that instead of having all of these projects, co-op projects, go private, they could have stayed basically middle income. So why was this opportunity lost?
Well, the pattern of subsidies, and if you look at the way they progressed through the 70s and 80s, there was a very strong belief in City Hall. And I don't mean just City Hall here, but City Halls around the country, that the only way these places were going to be built was if you built in dates certain to get out from under the strictures that were part of the development of the project in the first place. It succeeded so well, as it turned out, stabilizing whole parts of cities because of the bulk and scale of some of these developments, that the builders were flush enough to pay the fine to get out from under these forms of subsidies 5 and 10 years early. When they were put in place on the front end, it was unimaginable that the kind of dollars it would take to get out from under those subsidy schemes. I mean, they put the figures in, they built the figures into the contracts, assuming that no one would ever pay them. And sure enough, the land and the buildings, because they succeeded so well in various places, the land and the buildings finally became so valuable that some of these developers said, hey, bailing out early makes all kinds of economic sense, even if I have to take this enormous hit in order to get out from under these restrictions and go to market level rent, for instance, 10 years early.
I know what you're thinking of. Shalom is voted to become private. People living in them chose to become private. And that's a whole nother discussion, but the reality is that we had all sorts of programs that provided different levels of rent and purchase levels, and all that seems to have gone. I think we need to understand that. Yes. Amy?
Hi. When Jane Jacobs was alive, the Village Voice was a big deal. Today, it is not. Ray, you were just with Al Jazeera, which is no longer. Can you talk a little bit about the way the media ecology has changed in discussing some of the things we're talking about? There's not as much space, I would suspect, today as there once was, and Roberta can add to that as well.
Real estate sections in big metropolitan newspapers, but also lifestyle sections have created a tremendous amount of virtue and buzz and desirability around a certain kind of life, and they are partners. They are partners in making Williamsburg, Williamsburg, and trying to figure out where the next new place is. I was with former Mayor, now Michael Nutter, of Philadelphia a couple of weeks ago, and he says, you know, the next time I read about one of the neighborhoods in my city being the New Brooklyn, I'm going to throw the paper out the window and then jump out after it myself, because that's what now all of these different places around the country want to be, the New Brooklyn. Fond as I am of the old Brooklyn, I can understand why they want that. It is, yes, the media very much is a part of this story. I mean, who was the great tabloid hero of crisis-ridden New York in the 1980s and 1990s? He's going to be the next Republican nominee for the presidency, shockingly. But, you know, and who was he? He was a real estate developer. And the only time growing up, I heard that name was because of the enormous development down in Coney Island where a lot of my friends live. So, these are strange days we're living in. I mean, who would even know the names of developers? And now they are big guys who get a lot of coverage in metropolitan newspapers like the New York Times.
The Village Voice, for those of you, and some of you probably do remember, was critical in covering the fights that Jane Jacobs led. She once commented that she found out about the expressway through a priest in the neighborhood because nobody was writing about it until the Village Voice, as well as the road through Washington Square and the development over on the far west side. For some of you may or may not know, I am a product of the old New York Post. You all know what that means. Mr. Murdoch came in 1978 and I left. However, in the early period, we covered the city. We covered neighborhoods. I was able to go out and find those stories about people other than just the New Brooklyn. In those days, it was actually the rejuvenating neighborhoods that people didn't believe that was happening. The South Bronx and New Brooklyn, but the press is very much responsible for the lack of coverage in our cities, I do believe, of the kind of things that we need to read about. And the access to the press, of the voices and the people who need it most, is not there the way it used to be. Now, the reality is, when I worked for the New York Post, there were 7 newspapers in this city. And I never kidded myself that I had a readership as large I would have liked. But I did have the readership of editors from the other papers. And the stories that I would write were often appearing sometime later in other papers because the competition in covering the city was great. It's not the same today, and we have papers that cover the nation more than they cover the city. So that is very much a problem, although we have to acknowledge that social media has filled some of the gap, and this is changing. We at the Center for the Living City, that's one of the things that we do that we're so proud of. We are getting the stories out of people who are fighting for their communities, rebuilding their communities, dealing with the issues of our time.
I'm kind of surprised that Corbusier had a very long career, and he was a theorist, and his idea of, tearing down Paris, I don't think he really meant it. And the actual buildings, if anybody has already or takes the tour of what he built, like the Unité d'Habitation, it's wonderful and so carefully designed. And his influence was enormous because he was the person, like Frank Lloyd Wright, who thought of a modern urbanist for the age of the automobile machine and everything, But the best modern buildings in New York, like Chatham Towers over here by Grusin and Kelly, I think it was, is completely Corbusian, and people love those apartments today. That was a subsidized housing project, as was Roosevelt Island. The proportions of the apartments they're I sound like Donald Trump, wonderful. They're exquisitely designed. And yet, there's very little appreciation for those buildings. And then Chandigarh in India, the city of Chandigarh, I've been there. It's extraordinary. They used sustainable local materials, no air conditioning, but unfortunately, it's the Gandhi vision of building. And unfortunately, in India today, they're building air-conditioned junk that isn't going to last in the climate. And his Corbusier's vision has been forgotten, even though Chandigarh is the one new city in India that really works. So I guess I'm sitting here thinking this Corbusier bashing is a bit much, because he was a humanist, very much so. And he came out of a time where Europe had been smashed to smithereens, and he really understood issues of class and community, and he wanted to build so that people could be housed, because housing was so necessary. And he did it in a sensitive way. The problem is he got so badly copied. So that said,
A lot of the public housing projects that were built along Michigan Avenue on the south side of Chicago were straight out of his copybook. But they did a lot of damage to a lot of neighborhoods, but they weren't the comprehensive projects that he built, that he designed, that he proposed to meet various aspects of human need. There was no commercial space, so you bulldoze Bronzeville, part of Bronzeville, the historic Black Belt on the south side, and you build a series of, I think it's called Prairie Village Estates, straight down Michigan Avenue, and there are no stores anywhere near there. You actually have to go somewhere else to buy a loaf of bread or a quart of milk. It was not receptive to people's needs. It was not meant for the people whose neighborhood was bulldozed to make way for it. And a lot of what has been, I don't know, what would we call it, neo-Corbusian in the United States, is not actually what he designed, but taking various parts of Radiant City ideas. But these lovely greenswards that were supposed to surround these buildings in splendid isolation ended up being blasted patches of sort of free fire zone as society lost control of these places. They weren't any longer coherent blocks where people lived in a humane scale, but instead were a place where the people on the 24th floor were fighting the people on the 18th floor who were total strangers to them. It was not, if you leveled tenement housing and put people in those things, you weren't doing them a favor. So I don't want to be accused of sort of slapdash Corbusier bashing. But a lot of his ideas that were put to work in the United States were executed badly and were actually hateful to neighborhood life.
I'd like to ask another Jane question of Ray. There are people who will say, yeah, Jane Jacobs was then, 50 years ago, but now is now. And she's of the past. This is the present. How would you say Jane Jacobs is relevant to today's issues?
Well, I think a lot about what life's going to be like when we have have another 10, 15, 20 years of the fastest growing age cohort in the population being people over 80. I was down in Jupiter, Florida, watching people trying to cross the street. And an elderly couple made it to the green strip in the middle of a 6-lane suburban road that was a highway in everything but name. It was called something Avenue, but it was really a highway that just didn't look like a highway, but it behaved like a highway. And the light only stayed green long enough for them to make it to the middle, and then they had to stand there while people making left turns whipped past them at 40 miles an hour. They looked terrified, and I thought, this is going to be a bad place to be old, folks. Jane Jacobs was writing about a Manhattan that had a lot more kids in it than today's Manhattan does. Jane Jacobs was talking about a city that was demographically different from today's city. And I think the idea of putting humane scale at the heart of any inquiries about how we're going to proceed, how we want to live, what the places we live in should be like, has to keep human beings at the center of the equation. That's what Jane Jacobs wanted. But it's going to have to respond to a different time, a different economy, different family structure. The fastest growing form of household right now consists of 4% of all households. Consists of a single person. That number is only going to go up in the coming decades. So some of the ideas contained in the early books certainly were very much of their time, and we're going to need a sort of 21st century dust-off of some of those ideas to respond to the way family formation and community structure and all these things have changed in the intervening years. I don't think it's a period piece, but I think the ideas have to be re-examined and updated for a time that's very different from that time.
What Jane Jacobs was really about was about designing for people, cities for people. And in the case of either the elderly or the young, the first thing she would say is you have to have a street that you can cross, and a park that you can walk to, and a store that you can walk to. And the kind of communities you're describing are the ones that were remade in another vision, and I think it's going to be very interesting in the next decades to see how they will be rebuilt more along the old lines than the new. Did we have a question? We have, yeah.
I don't know how big a piece is of the whole picture, but I'm wondering about how the internet economy fits in with entities like Uber and Airbnb as people try to monetize their own properties and the involvement of corporations.
People don't gather by the hundreds and the thousands to refine sugar on the East River, or make shoes in St. Louis, or Haverhill, or Lawrence. That kind of world. Manufacturing is not dying, it's not disappearing. You can still make a lot of stuff, but when you go into a factory now, it's a fairly small number of people tending a large number of machines that are doing most of the things. So when late 19th century, the first people trying to write about what large-scale urban living was going to mean to people, and they wrote about anomie, and they wrote about isolation, and tried to imagine all those people in bedsits and garrets and what it meant to live by yourself. I think they may have had a more contemporary fix on what it's like to earn a living here now than people who were writing in the 50s and 60s. There are large numbers of people who work alone now and work at home now, connected to their office by a computer, who have to build in the discipline of actually getting dressed because they find that it makes them feel like they're more seriously about the business of earning a living if they're not in a robe and slippers, but nobody would know if they're in a robe and slippers. Like they say, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. So I think we're going to, I think places, as one writer called it, the third good place, is going to become more important. And we're seeing that already, I think, in a lot of places, where you are when you're not at home, where you are when you're not at your terminal, is going to become even more important. Either that or there's going to be a lot more people living pretty weird lives. Because we are, I think, social animals that thrive on collaborative experience. And this new way of working, which is not as big a feature of the economies in other places in the country, but it's really taken root here. And I guess we got to see where it goes. I don't. It's a great question, but one that we don't know the answer to yet.
If you go and read The Economy of Cities, what you will see that Jane was writing about was not about a now. She was writing about process, an economic process. And that process was very open to change. In the last years of her life, I know I had conversations with her in which she was so intrigued by the fact that there were people in places like Brooklyn and other old neighborhoods who were making new things. 1 or 2 people starting new businesses. It's a very fluid kind of vision, and it's about a process. It's never about products. She may have been writing about a particular time, but it wasn't a frozen time. And it's a very enlightening approach to understanding how the economy of a city works, how it functions. And it's never about the then, it's always about the now and what's coming. And she always said, never assume that what's happening today will be happening tomorrow.
So you want to take,
One more question.
One more question?
Right over here.
I wanted to go back to the last topic, making streets safer. There's been a lot of hoopla about bike lanes, but a lot of their projects have been street safety improvements, closing slip lanes and other places where intersections are not perpendicular. And every time DOT wants to do this, they have to propose it to the local community board. And more times than not, the community boards oppose these projects and say, I use that slip lane in my car. And it seems somewhat ironic that, community boards, somewhat the product of ignoring what people had to say in their own communities before the 60s and 70s, is now being used to, put an end to projects that Jane Jacobs herself would endorse.
It's one of the hardy perennials in neighborhood scale debates in cities around the country. Because what do motorists pressure municipalities to do? They pressure them to create conditions to have surface traffic move more quickly and expeditiously from place to place on streets. So people complain about the timing of lights, they complain or agitate for fewer parking rows because rows of parked cars actually calm the speeds of surface traffic. They agitate against things like building islands in intersections which force people to take left turns more slowly. The amazing thing about a car is that once you're behind the wheel, you could forget you were ever a pedestrian. And in these fights, cars win a lot because people think about convenience But they don't think that as much or as deeply, I suspect or suggest, as about their convenience and safety as a pedestrian. But one of the byproducts of faster traffic speeds in some of these places that have been re-engineered for the convenience of drivers is that more pedestrians get killed. And in changing neighborhoods where you have, for instance, large immigrant families where there's a large extended family but only one car, so many of the family members move around the community on foot. We're seeing this a lot in suburban Maryland, in places like Tacoma Park and Bethesda and Silver Spring. People are getting killed on suburban-style streets because they aren't designed to be crossed. Even when you're using a crosswalk and crossing with a light, they're not designed to be crossed. There's no expectation that there's going to be people there. The battle between the pedestrian and the motor car started in New York in like 1906 with the first pedestrian death. And we have a tendency to blame pedestrians for pedestrian deaths. The car is oddly indemnified and at the same time is oddly isolating when you drive it. You feel very powerful, you feel very impatient, you want to move faster. It's weird for that to be the tendency, and I know that it is, in this, the most pedestrian-centered city in North America. More people walk more to more places than any other place in the United States here. And yet, at the same time, we've still let the car win a lot of arguments that it shouldn't ought to win. And, you know, what would it take? Would it take more pedestrians dying? It's a terrible thing. But the fights over bike lanes are like another thing altogether. Some of those are just crazy. But the ones about putting in traffic calming measures to protect people on foot, those just beggar the imagination. I think, you know, if there's one place a pedestrian ought to be able to win, it's New York. Or where the pedestrian is not the suspected party at fault in every accident. You would hope that that place would be New York. I was just in London the week before last, and they're building bike highways in a tremendously congested city. But now, the easier they're making it to bike, and let's face it, the weather in London stinks. And more of the year, more people are commuting all the time. So now in the congestion district, in the center of the city, there are as many people on bikes as there are on cars. That's an astounding thing. It's an astounding thing to build across Blackfriars Bridge and Battersea Bridge, all these bridges. They're setting aside a big chunk of the roadbed for bicycles, and instead of it being some sad, forlorn, empty patch on the street, it's full of bikes. On a cold, drizzly, crummy day, it's full of bikes because it's become so awful to drive in central London, and expensive, I should add, that it actually looks like a good deal to save your heart, save your lungs, and save your money, and bike into work. I think we're going to have to do a better job. And an aging society is one where I think actually the pedestrian might have a chance of evening the terrible disequilibrium in those debates about who uses the street and how the street is going to get used and in whose interest the street operates.
And just think back, over the last 10 years, this city has been transformed in terms of pedestrians and bikes. And as Jane pointed out, that everything that she wrote about, it will not happen overnight. It will be slow and steady. And there's one little story you should all know, that Jan Gehl, the fabulous urbanist in Copenhagen, must be now 40, maybe 50 years ago, he started reducing the number of parking spaces in Coconut by 3% a year. No one noticed because it was such a small amount. But each year, with that diminishment, was an increase in the number of bikes. And I was so envious. I was there not quite a year ago, and like Ray just described about London, which I didn't know, there are bike highways on the roads with people in pushing baby carriages, groceries, and suitcases and everything. It's happened. New York has come a long way, but one of the things that has happened over the years, as people have moved back, particularly young people have moved from the suburbs, they bring their suburban mindset and their driving habits with them. So the community board arguments you're talking about, these are communities often lived in by people who are used to the car culture and are not giving it up easily. But at the same time, if we look back, we have come a long way, and I suspect we will continue in this direction, a few fits and starts in the next decade. On that note, I'd like to thank you all for coming, to remind you that June 15th, we have Elizabeth Barlow Rogers coming, and you will all get a list of our future lectures, and by all means come. And I want to thank Ray for taking that Bulgarian railroad from Washington,